get connected to Search Fund Alliance. So I worked at LEK Consulting for 6 years, and that's where I got to know MK. He's one of the first folks I got to know when I moved to the US. I started my career at LEK's Munich office, where I did 2 years there, and then I did 4 years at the LA office. At LEK's LA office, I nicknamed MK to MKpedia for his vast knowledge of various topics that you never knew existed. And yeah, we've remained friends since. I consider him a mentor, and he's been very helpful to me the last 10 years as I've started my company. And we are a sponsor of the Search Fund Alliance. And as we were talking earlier this year around what topic might be interesting for the group here to chat about, we thought about pricing because my firm ECA, we work with primarily private equity firms and their portfolio companies. And we have two main service offerings. One is our executive search offering. I think the folks within the Search Fund Alliance mostly know us for that piece of work we do. And then about half of our business actually comes from our consulting side. And on the consulting side, we work a lot with private equity owned companies on pricing engagements. And I was telling MK that that's a topic that is becoming more and more popular across kind of like middle market, lower middle market, private equity owned companies to dive into. And he thought it was a good topic to discuss, and we discussed it with April, and I thought it would be a good topic for everyone to do an overview of how we've tackled this topic for some other clients. So with that, I'll hand over to Bert.
Perfect. That was a great intro there, Ada. I'm going to share my screen with everybody here, so that way you can all follow along. Let me know when you've got our slideshow up. Does everyone see that, or does everyone see my? Okay, perfect. So jumping right in here. So Ada already gave a nice little overview of himself. I myself, I'm a managing director here with ECA, Ada's team. I'm from a manufacturing and engineering background. Got into some consulting with Oliver Wyman out of their New York office, mostly working with private equity clientele before coming and joining Ada's team. And I'm sort of the focal leader for our pricing efforts across ECA, and thought it would be a really interesting opportunity here to chat with you all today. So jumping down, I know we already kind of covered this. Ada shared a little bit about what ECA does, give a great overview effectively of our main offerings, both in the full-time search as well as project-based engagements. Jumping down here. So for today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about our perspective on pricing, approaches to pricing, solutions for pricing. We have a cool demo of a pricing tool that one of our panelists is going to share. And then we're going to pretty quickly jump into a Q&A session with our panelists. What I ask is that you keep your questions and comments to the panel discussion. We've got a dedicated slot there for when we can kind of open up the conversation to all your different questions and comments. And then we'll wrap up, give you your afternoons back, and wish you a happy holidays. So without further ado, we can jump right in and talk a little bit about pricing. So, you know, as the title of the discussion sort of indicated, what we do see is that pricing is probably one of the easiest margin plays out there that we see a lot of search fund backed companies not really using. So here, just kind of showing a very kind of basic visual depiction of the effects of pricing on profitability. So just look at the math. Looking at this hypothetical P&L structure, let's just assume you improve your fixed costs, your variable costs, your volume, and pricing each by 5%. And so really in terms of hitting the bottom line, pricing improvements kind of blow the rest out of the water. It's pretty easy to see that here. So, okay, great, Bert. It's not that simple. And I totally appreciate that there's nuances out there and different factors for different kinds of businesses. So really we see three main approaches to pricing depending on the type of business, depending on the type of industry that you're in. Cost-based pricing, dynamic pricing, and then value-based pricing. So pretty familiar territory here for you guys. Nothing mind-blowing, but at a high level, you've got your capital-intensive, manufacturing businesses, mostly running some sort of a cost-plus type of a pricing on the left. In the middle, what you've got is a lot of travel, hospitality, some pretty advanced brick and mortars out there getting pretty agile and flexible with pricing based on instantaneous demand. And then finally, on the right, you've got the B2B services arena where quantifying value is really more based on what the customer perceives the value to be. So that's why value-based pricing. So breaking down those pricing approaches into three buckets, you can kind of see and look at how each how to affect pricing in each of those scenarios. Moving on here, we then sort of break down things into the type of engagement models that exist for those different scenarios. A lot of words on this page, but high level here from the top of the pile, everyone knows the the MBB, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. These are your premium consulting players out there. They charge a premium for their services, and they're the ones typically working with the Fortune 1000s and those big budgets out there. Moving down, you've got the boutique players, like some of the folks on our panel today. Typically have a deep focus and expertise in their particular realm. This can be a little bit of a challenging arena, honestly, to play because it's tough to know what you're going to get with the person that you're bringing on unless you've worked with them before or have some really strong referrals. The third option is kind of where ECA comes into the picture. Typically, we're connecting clients with players from those boutique arenas, as well as some of those ex-premium consultants. And here, what you've got is more of a rigorous vetting, some repetitions with this model, so you can be a little bit more confident in the quality that you're going to get. So as with the boutique players, though, it still can be hard to know when you've got an agency that actually gets it or doesn't get it, and therefore, sometimes they could be passing on a consultant who equally may get it or not get it. So those strong referrals and past experience working with them, still comes into play in that situation. Moving down here, number 4, what we've got is some of these technology tools that are geared towards very specific iterative analytical client data sets. A lot of times the service there is involving some sort of a tool running some ongoing analytics to continuously optimize pricing in one way or another. One thing to consider in this situation is that recurring cost of the tool in the background. And this last option we always have to include because it always gets used, but this is the friends and close contacts option. This can be great and cheap if you've got the right network out there, but can also be disastrous for all the reasons that we can each sort of probably attest a story or two of when that goes sour. But on the whole, everyone, you've got a pretty wide spectrum of options out there to plug into, and it's certainly hard to know, what's going to make sense for your business. So how do you assess the trade-offs and make the right choice? It's a really tough challenge. What we try to do here is just build a simple 2-axis model. You got likelihood of success against cost. And definitely some nuances here, variability, but generally going low and to the left, you're going to be risking a lot. And there's a lot of considerations to take into account. obviously your budget. Don't forget those recurring monthly service costs. You got to do your due diligence on the expertise, both functionally and industry-wise, for the person that you're going to be plugging in. And I think maybe one of the most important messages from my little stump speech here is this last comment. Resist that brother-in-law option unless absolutely necessary. I know he's going to give you a deal, but Christmas next year might be a little weird if the project was a flop and you didn't have the heart to fire him on day 2 when you should have. But you know, honestly, one of our highest rated consultants is also one of our most expensive. So it's you know, the cheap neighbor option is not necessarily going to be the best gold mine out there for you. But anyways, this is sort of our general perspective on the pricing arena. It's a wide field, and you really do have to find the right fit for your business. And you know, today we're going to talk about a few different options and have some panelists with some experiences from a few different arenas. So with that, we're going to jump over and get right into our tool demo. So I'm going to introduce you to Jeremiah, who's going to show us a little bit about his pricing tool that at a high level he's been kind of developing to bring, I'd say a good way to put it, bring some of the Fortune 100 pricing expertise to that lower middle market where a lot of you guys are playing. So he spent a lot of his career in pricing, a good amount of his time with Caterpillar pricing their parts for their mining division. So without further ado, Jeremiah, if you want to jump on and share your screen, I'll yield the floor to you.
Sure, no problem. I will get that going right now. All right, can everyone see my screen? All right. So like Bert said, I've spent most of my career in pricing. Most recently, I was with Caterpillar in charge of the pricing in their mining division. Before that, I was at a lot of small and medium-sized companies in the transportation and packaging industries. So I've seen pricing done at the Fortune 100 level, as well as at the very small $30 million family-owned level early in my career. And then most recently, I branched out on my own and started my own pricing consultant company to bring that Fortune 100 pricing expertise to small and medium-sized businesses. You know, I've worked with the Vendavos and Pros from a pricing software. I've worked with the McKinseys and Ernst & Young pricing consultants in my time at Caterpillar. And like Britt said, they do really great things. But there's also a lot of room out there to just bring a simple, fast, and cost-effective solution to companies to allow them to measure and manage the impact of price on their business. And that's really sort of what sets my approach apart. It's you know, it gets back to what we all know is you can't improve what you can't measure. And I feel one of the foundations of pricing is being able to measure the impact that pricing has on your bottom line. And you can see the quote there on the bottom of one of the CEOs of one of the companies that I work with, where he said the ability to measure where we get more price in our pocket outside of other influences like volume and mix is what positions us to be more profitable than our competition. And I couldn't have said it better myself. It's just what we believe to be the foundation, no matter where you go on the pricing journey with cost plus or value-based pricing or any of the sophisticated pricing tools. The ability to set a plan and measure the impact pricing has is sort of foundational to whatever pricing approach you sort of choose. And so with that, we'll get into the model and I'll show you how that model works. Just by way of a little bit of background, the data I'm showing you is from a manufacturing company. They have several different business units that they've acquired over the years that all run independently, sort of as small mom and pop business units, if you will. They supply plumbing and washroom fixtures for industrial washrooms through a network of distributors, wholesale sales agents, and those kind of things, ultimately selling to contractors and subcontractors for new construction, etc. So if I can get over to the right. Trying to find. Just trying to find I have too many windows open. Sorry for that. All right. Can everyone see my screen now still?
Yep,
Yes.
we still see your screen. It's still the PowerPoint though.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. So this is the dashboard for the company I was talking about. So within this business unit, we across the top, we have our KPIs. We have our revenue on the left, our price realization dollars in the middle, and our price realization percentage on the right-hand side. And so we can see that blue represents the actuals and the orange tick marks and lines, if you will, represent the plan that we put in place. And so one of the key things we do when we put this approach in place is we have to make a price plan, how between the combination of price increases and decreases and tools and strategies that you're going to implement, how much price, positive or negative, are you going to get out of the different business segments within your company. And so we accumulate all that together, accumulate that data, and put together a price plan and then measure our results against that price plan. So we can see for this business, you know, they increased the revenue from 11.4 to 12.6. The price plan had them doing $300,000 of additional price. They actually exceeded that and got $400,000 of additional price. And then on the right-hand side, it has those same numbers in terms of percentage. On the bottom of our screen within this tool, we have the ability to drill into our business on a more granular level to find, you know, customers and products and segments that might be driving that improvement or falling behind and offer additional areas for improvement. So on the left, we have product IDs and products that we use to drill into with product families. And on the right, we have customer size, region, distribution channel, and those kind of things where we can drill into it. And so, you know, even though for this business, they had a great year, they exceeded the price realization, they generated 130,000, 140,000 more price, $1.2 million in sales growth while they generated that additional price. We can see when we drill in that there are still areas for improvement, and this tool helps us identify those. So we can see on this individual product, it has a price realization of 2.75%, and it's underperforming its peers because most of its peers in this product category are actually exceeding the plan realization, and this one fell short by about 0.25%. So we go to our other views within here and get into our customer segmentation view. And this allows us to really drill in and see what's going on with pricing in our business. So for this particular business, discounting and how much discount they give through all of their channels of wholesale and sales agents is a key driving factor. So we have some customer size charts on the top that tell us what the different color bubbles mean for customer size. And then on the bottom, we get into seeing how much discount we're giving based on customer size and how much discount we're giving on invoice, still within this same product ID that we identified on the main dashboard as being one of the problems and one of the underperformers relative to its peer. We can see as we color code, the green and purple bubbles are representing our largest customers, while the yellow bubbles are representing some of the smaller customers. We can quickly identify that one of our smaller customers, 313540, is getting a far bigger discount than a lot of our biggest customers. And when we identify that, we work with the sales managers and business managers to create a plan and say, what's going on here? Why is this customer getting an unequitably large discount compared to all the peers in that same category? And further, we click on that bubble, we can drive down and look in this chart and see the individual invoices. Some of them might be hidden behind the screen panel on everyone's faces over here. But it'll isolate the individual invoices and transactions that is going for. So it shows you how you can quickly use this tool to measure your results on that first page, come into your segmentation views on the second page, and identify individual customers and individual transactions where you may be underperforming peers, or where if you see that you're missing your plan and missing your target as a whole, find out the customers and transactions that are driving that. And I guess one other point to note as we're looking at this particular example before we move to the next one is we're looking at a full 12 years of a full year, 1 year over 2 years of history here, 12 months of history. In actuality, when you're using this tool, you would be going real time and you would be able to identify these customers and these transactions on a week to week or month to month basis and take action immediately so that you didn't have to wait to the end of the year to see your results. You could improve your price positioning mid-year, mid-business cycle, if you will. The next thing that's also powerful in this tool when we talk about measuring the effects of price on our business is if we go out back to the main dashboard, one of their other business units in this company. So this business unit is not using the price lever to increase price. Sometimes you might find that there is an opportunity to drive bottom line growth, bottom line improvement through growth. So the price plan for this business unit, and this is more of your stainless steel bathroom fixtures, paper towel dispensers, things of that nature. Not a very specialized market. It's a very commoditized market. And so the plan was to reduce price. The plan was to take $400,000 of price reductions. In actuality, it took almost $700,000 of price reductions, but drove a $3.6 million improvement in revenue from 43 up to $46 million. But one of the questions that I always get from leadership when you put in this kind of a price plan is, that's great, we gave up $700,000 of profit off the bottom line to get $3 million of sales. Did I actually make more money at the end of the day? And that's where we also have this view in here to do a year-on-year comparison in a waterfall chart to see the answer to some of those questions. So you can see on our waterfall chart, we have our list price, we have our discounting because it's a heavily discounted industry, to get to our revenue where we see 43.6 million going up to 46.8 million. Then we have a lot of our off-invoice hidden costs, if you will, like commissions and freight allowances and extended terms and off-invoice rebates to ultimately get to our pocket sales number. And then we have our material costs, labor costs, and overhead costs as well to ultimately get to the amount of margin we're putting in our bottom line. So you can see that even though we did decrease the price by about $700,000 that we saw on the main dashboard, the resulting increase in sales we were able to drive, we increased our margin from 12.9 million up to 13.3 million. So we generated about $400,000 increase in margin with that sales improvement. So it was definitely worth the plan being put in place to drive that bottom line margin improvement, which is one of the main reasons this chart also exists in the tool. And then just one other point I'd like to make on this screen is, you can also use this waterfall chart to easily identify what I like to call price leaks, where we have commission and freight allowance and extended terms and off-invoice rebates. So these are things that aren't easily recognizable in a lot of analytics and a lot of day-to-day business management. But on this waterfall chart, we can quickly see that we gave away $10,000 more in extended payment terms and about $60,000 more in additional off invoice rebate. That was not part of the plan. That means we have some sales agents out there giving away more than that top level price decrease that was in the plan. We can dig into there, find out which individual sales agents are giving those extended payment terms and offering those additional rebates at the end of the year, and work with our sales managers and regional managers to get in there and correct it. So, this is a really powerful tool. I'm just scratching the surface to give you a taste of what this does, but I think this is foundational to any sort of pricing approach, this ability to measure where you're getting price, where you're missing your plan, and do that in real time with your data to be able to correct it within the business cycle, not have to wait till quarter's end or fiscal year end to look how your pricing did for the year. And anytime someone embarks on a pricing journey, I feel this is one of the key foundational items they have to use to do that. And one other point, I know we're showing a manufacturing business here that has lots of SKUs and product ideas. This same approach does work in service settings as well. You'd have to modify your approach, like I did in the transportation industry, to a key metric. Like I couldn't control the number of miles to get from point A to point B. I can only control the revenue I'm getting from point A to point B. So in the transportation industry, our key metric for price was dollars per mile. And our price plan would be based on improving dollars per mile from $1.50 to $1.60 per mile. And for whatever service industry it is that you're providing, you'd have to find and work to get that KPI, and then we would build a dashboard around that KPI. So this same approach works whether you're in the manufacturing environment or a service environment. It's the core principles behind it of measuring where you're getting price and where you're falling short that allows this approach to be successful. And then you layer all your other pricing strategy and pricing capability on top of that to really drive your bottom line improvement. So with that, I think that was my 15-minute demo to get us 30. And I think at that point, it's time to turn it back over to Bert.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremiah. Very cool tool. And like you said, I think, just scratching the surface on capabilities in this tool, and an interesting way to go about, visualizing a lot of the opportunities there. So thank you for that. So with that, what we're going to do now is we're going to jump over and turn it over to our panelists. I brought it up here on the screen. What we got is a great group of very generous folks who have volunteered their time here today. Hopefully all of you have kind of come armed with some good questions. Otherwise, I do have a few to spark the conversation. But so first, what I'm going to do is just give each panelist a little bit of time to introduce themselves, give a quick overview of their relationship with the pricing arena. So, for no other reason than the order of the slide, I'm going to start with you, Jim. Jim Perry here. So without further ado, go ahead, Jim, take it away. Give yourself a little bit of an intro.
All right. Thank you, Bert. So my name is Jim Perry. I think unlike the other panelists here, I have never been a consultant for pricing or for anything else. I've only worked in industry for companies, but have spent about 18 years in the pricing space. So that I was just seeing was divided equally. I spent 6 years in the automotive industry with Chrysler and Mercedes, focused specifically on pricing. I had spent some other years there in finance and marketing roles. But then when Chrysler was going bankrupt, I moved from there to a agricultural equipment company called AGCO and started up a pricing function there. And so we put together a group that did a number of the things that actually Jeremiah was just showing us, and spent 6 years there. And then the final 6 years, the last 6, I have joined KKR and and worked primarily with a couple of the portfolio companies they have, industrial companies, Gardner Denver, and now Ingersoll Rand. So I lead the pricing initiative there. And that's a quick summary.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Moving on, we've got Adrienne Gordon. Adrienne, if you want to take a few minutes and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. So I'm one of those few individuals that chose pricing to be a career. So I did a couple years in industrial sales and product management, and then ended up doing a pilot of strategic pricing for a company called Parker Hannifin, which is a conglomerate of 138 or so manufacturing and distribution companies back in the 90s, and it became very lucrative. So I basically became a project manager there for about 8 years, deploying it across the earth with 138 different companies, which was a really amazing experience because I got to learn from all of the other, big firm consultants on how they do pricing. I also was able to do a software deployment. I ran pricing for American Greetings for a couple years, something a little different, and then did internal consulting for Eaton. I've been consulting for the last about 13 years. I own 2 companies. One is Pricing Empowered. Pricing Empowered is more of your traditional boutique pricing consulting firm, really focused on full engagements. So we do strategy, we do policy, we do process, we do analytics all around pricing. We have a second firm that's newer, it's being launched this year, really focused on an online platform that allows smaller companies to pull on-demand pricing tools, consulting tools, to allow them to have access to, again, these Fortune 100 type of offerings.
Perfect. Thanks, Adrienne. James, you're up.
Thanks, Bert. Hi, everybody. Appreciate your time this afternoon. So my background, again, it's a great panel here. I think it's a little bit distinctive from Jim or Adrienne, and that's a good thing for everyone participating. I started my career actually as an investment banker, and then switched over to management consulting, in which I sort of predominantly operated in the strategy space, and my focus over a decade and a half or so has been around helping companies grow. Right. So thinking about all the questions that involve, sort of growing, however you want to define growth, but certainly to top line growth, for sure. And when I say growth, I'm kind of thinking sort of sustainable, competitive growth that's rooted for me usually in an understanding of customer, and that immediately sort of yields the pricing question, right? So how do you use price as a true lever to drive the growth outcomes that you're seeking? And that's I think a lot of the work that I have done. My clients have been sort of a diverse range of financial institutions. I've helped some of the largest sort of banks in the world think about how to price the financial products that they're offering, all the way through sort of the Silicon Valley, new ventures looking to understand what role price plays in their value proposition. And I think that the thought sort of that I think I bring to the table that may add to the others that we've talked to so far is that I often help companies think about the truly strategic questions around price, not sort of, certainly what the pricing architecture should be and what the price levels should be. Yes, that's the end product, but the first question sort of, what is our value proposition? How does price play into that? And what is the relative value that customers place on different elements of our offering, including price as one lever, right? So I'll give you a quick example is, a recent project that ECA and I collaborated on for a client involved a sort of a mid-sized disruptive player in the real estate transaction business, that was trying to figure out how to truly disrupt kind of both buyers and sellers of real estate, and bring a unique offering to the table that was predominantly digital in nature. And I helped this firm conduct some very sort of quick but deep market research and understanding customers' preferences, and doing some real analytically based research that is sort of choice-based conjoint work around which values of the offering were most important to them, which planks of the offering were most important to them, on which did they place the most value, and then how did you price accordingly based on those findings, different segments, different value propositions, different prices. So that's usually where I kind of play in the pricing conversation. Happy to take questions as we go forward. Thanks.
Awesome. Appreciate that very much. Unfortunately, Tom, our last panelist, wasn't able to join today. He fell ill. So what we've got is the three folks that we've just been introduced to. So now, opportunity now to open up the floor to questions. I don't know if any of you have sent any over to Ada via the chat function. But what I can do is maybe just start the conversation off with a question that I know is out there. So I'll put this to each of the panelists, and you can each answer. But high level here, theory is one thing, reality is another. Looking back at the companies that you've worked with over your years, maybe without naming names of companies, but maybe just mention industry and maybe rough size of the company. By how much were you able to improve bottom line results? Maybe just starting with you, Jim, give us some thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so maybe the best example is the agricultural company that I was with, because when I came in there really was not a pricing function other than the administrative pricing group, and so there really hadn't been efforts to really drive margin improvement via pricing. And so by going from that rather low level and putting that in place in a 4-year time frame, the North America portion, which again was close to $2 billion in revenue, but we got an 8% margin improvement, 8 percentage points. And not all of that was due to pricing, but certainly over half, the majority of it was due to pricing. And so, that's a quick answer to the question, coming from a very low level of pricing up and instituting some of the things that we've talked about so far. I would say 6 percentage point margin improvement.
Very cool. Awesome. That's a great example. Adrian, any good examples from your experiences?
So in the last 20 some odd years, I've come up with a rule that any company has 2 to 4 points sitting on the table. Usually the rule of thumb I use is companies who haven't really thought about and focused on pricing, they're usually going to be in one of two states. One is total chaos, right? So during their growth period, they just negotiated, so price is a little bit everywhere. Or they're treating everybody the same. So if all your customers get the same price all the time, by definition, you're sub-optimizing. So for companies that have chaos, they tend to be a little higher, that 4%. Companies that have no differentiation, they'd be a little bit lower, but those are very real numbers. The 8% is a real number too. It just triggered memory of a smaller company I actually worked with. It was on the lower end of our client size, but probably about 28 million a year in revenue. And this company didn't realize that they were a monopoly. So they were serving the Catholic churches, believe it or not. And there was dogma in the Catholic Church that said there was a certain specification for their product. And so it just took a little diving in on their value for them to suddenly realize that no one else could meet that specification. And so actually the first year we ended up having 8, their run rate was about 12%. So it was substantial.
Wow, impressive. Very, very impressive. James, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll just add. I think both Adrian and Jim gave great answers, and I would say I'm in the same zone in my experience as they are. I think to build particularly on Adrian's point, I would have said the same numbers I think that Adrian just mentioned. That 2 to 4% almost lying on the table in a sense, depending on where you are in your sophistication, I think is right. Right in the zone. I'll add though, as she pointed out, I think that depending on where you are in your maturity, there are sort of pricing, let's call it adjacent capabilities to actual pricing that can drive that number even further, right? So a lot of clients that I've worked with who have been more mature in pricing have had sort of what you might call kind of revenue realization issues, right? That is that they know how to price, but they're not sure if they're billing for all the revenue they're entitled to, and they're not sure if they're collecting all the revenue they're billing for, right? So when you start to expand the conversation that way, those numbers, double or triple, I think in size potentially, depending on where you stand. But I think overall, it kind of understanding where you begin is important. But there's upside, I think, in the range that we've talked about here.
Good point.
Thanks for that, James. And we do have a question from the audience from Hal. And I'd like to pose this question to Adrian. And then my suggestion is that Jim and James, you can comment afterwards on how you see the process being different in the industries or companies you work with. So a lot of the companies in the search fund alliance, they're what I would call lower middle market or smaller in size. And question we have from Hal is, for a software firm that has had a fairly low price license and maintenance model, what are steps to getting to higher prices? Now that's a very specific company type, but Adrian, maybe a little bit more broadly for smaller companies in the software space or the SaaS space, what are the general steps you'd say you want to go through in order to go through the whole like pricing engagement?
Yeah, one of my favorite go-tos for any company in any space, but especially to address the issue you have, is offer versions. Because as soon as you create two different versions of your service, your product, whatever, what you're going to be able to do is push the envelope a little bit. And I don't even know what, the incremental value is of that version, or maybe if it's in a step down, but if you can push the versions to have two different price points, you're suddenly controlling the value conversation with the customer, and they're not benchmarking you to their other alternatives. They're benchmarking you to you. And so you're going to immediately understand the segments of your business that is creating incremental value. And you're going to learn a lot, which is going to tell you exactly where you can further that price pressure, if that makes any sense.
Yep. Thanks for that, Adrian. And then maybe speaking a little bit more broadly, because we work across a lot of different clients on their pricing issues, and just kind of like going through the life cycle of what are the steps in a pricing engagement. And again, James and Jim, you can tell me where you've seen things being differently. Step one of it is for me to understand, okay, sizing the price, if you will, like how much could we expect to get from a pricing improvement in terms of margin improvements? And what is that worth to the company? And then seeing if the management team and the key stakeholders are aligned with that. And if they're not aligned with it, it's very little you could do to improve something. And then also kind of like starting to understand what are the options that they are open to experimenting with versus are going to be much more difficult to convince them on. Once you kind of like figure that out, you could start doing things through the tools that Jeremiah demoed for you and start small pilot projects and predict things and say, we think that the price is gonna, if we increase the price or decrease the price, this is what's gonna happen to volume and margins. And once you've kind of like started demonstrating some success there and showing people that your predictions aren't just theoretical, but they actually start coming through pretty accurately, then people start getting on board with this initiative and become believers, and it becomes much easier to influence them and keep improving things. But essentially, those are some of the rough steps. Now, there is also some preparation in terms of like getting access to past data, being able to integrate pricing tools like Jeremiah's into whatever ERP you're using. Those are also some of the other steps that we've seen could be involved. Jim, how do you see things differently?
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a lot of key topics there. I think one was the leadership buy-in. That to me becomes really a key, to have leadership really agreeing that this is the direction they want to try. Because I have seen in the past that if you push pricing initially, it is possible you may see a reduction in revenue. And I've seen people, leaders of certain product segments that immediately pulled back from it, and they didn't even want to go forward with it because they got scared. And so one, you have to have some commitment to try it and see it through. But assuming you have that, by starting small, by starting in one segment or one region or one product line, and being able to test it and see what the results are, to me, that's the biggest thing for for gaining widespread support across a business or across a company, because you do see an impact coming from it. And I guess the one other thing I'd say that you kind of alluded to was, we're talking about pricing here, but when you get a little bit broader, you can do things that, through the pricing tools and through, the demonstration we just saw, things like mix management, for example, that are not purely pricing things, but you can use pricing to drive improved mix. And that allows you to see, sometimes substantial margin improvement across a portfolio.
Perfect. Appreciate that. That was very, I think that's a good, insightful way to understand that it's not just always about, driving price on a particular item or a product line, but also about driving mix management. And I don't think everyone typically understands that you can use that lever to do that. Let's see. I'd say, James, if you want to weigh in on that, I'd say it would be interesting to hear your perspective on the topic.
Yeah, sure. The only thing I'd add to Jim's point, I think what I would build on is this, and the question sort of anticipates this a little bit. So in terms of how do you pick up the problem, right? So certainly, I completely agree with Jim that there are all kinds, and Adrienne from her prior answer, there are all kinds of ways to sort of do this in little, put the toe in the water, as it were, and do it in kind of little steps that don't disrupt your entire offering. Now that said, there's some sort of positionings in the marketplace and versus competitors and versus your sort of vis-a-vis your own customers, where differentiating price even on an experimental basis can be difficult, right? And actually may sort of requires a great deal of care, but also even then may still put the company and the value proposition and the brand at risk. So you don't have to go into this cold. I mean, this is kind of implied. There are ways to look at, I think, two things I would point out. One is, and it was hinted at, historical data, to the extent you've been in the game for a little while, and a little while doesn't have to be several years, right? But certainly, a couple of months, if at minimum, but certainly a year, maybe 18 months of recent transactional data can be pretty revealing when looked at kind of under the microscope by people who've looked at this kind of data before. Things you might miss, I think, sort of pop out to people who've spent years kind of looking at these kinds of things. There are all kinds of insights you can gather around sort of willingness to pay, just looking at win-loss data, for example, and fundamentally sort of demand elasticity, which is what we're, I think, talking about here in many respects, and from historical data. That's kind of one. Two, and I talked about this a little bit in the example I gave in a recent project that we worked on together, Bert. But I think the ability to sort of go out and do market research in a very compressed time frame, but get some really kind of meaningful insights. That is, you can use kind of analytical tools to ask customers about price in a way that's much more sophisticated than asking them, would you rather pay more or pay less? Because I guarantee you the answer is going to be pay less, right? So you use indirect questioning to kind of circle in on the problem, and you can produce some pretty detailed results that then hold up when you actually start changing price in the marketplace, right? And those insights can be important and a critical first step where you're concerned about sort of rocking the boat too quickly or their skepticism about the value proposition.
Yeah, James, and I think this comes back to a question we had from Carter here, and his question is around, how do you kind of like test, or how have you tested pricing when sales cycles are 9 to 12 months? And it seems to go a little bit hand in hand with what you're suggesting here, but if there are any nuances there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the nuance, I suppose,
the second part of that question, just to clarify, do you have ways to reach price conclusions without waiting for the dollars to be deposited? So are there any leading and lagging indicators that you found are helpful to track that can convince the team and direct the team in the right direction, if you will?
So let me answer the first part of that, and while I think about the second, I think just the nice thing about the research I'm describing, and again, this is for those of you who sort of think about these questions, what I'm referring to are kind of choice modeling exercises. Let me just describe what that is in terms of research, and you'll understand, I think, how this transcends the actual sales cycle. What you've wind up doing ultimately after asking sort of some profiling and behavioral questions in these kinds of research is that you lay out in front of a participant in the survey specific, literally product cards, you might call them, specific description of key value proposition elements of the product. And you might array 3 or 4 of those next to each other and ask a simple question: which of these do you prefer? And if you use the right analytical techniques and cycle through all of those various combinations, and you do so at large enough numbers, and large enough numbers doesn't mean millions or even thousands. I think the last one we did had 300 or 400 participants that we found who had kind of valid answers we could use. You can kind of very quickly hone in on how customers are likely to respond to your offering in the marketplace, and then translate that into dollars, right, that you expect to gain. So you can anticipate not only kind of how much more revenue you might generate from a marginal point of view in terms of the price, but also what the likely take-up changes and take-up rates for different product offerings, would be in the marketplace versus your own possibilities, or versus your competitors, right? So actual offerings in the marketplace. So I think that is all in a sense preemptive, right? And how do you go out and test that? Well, depending on, I would say the second answer is, in my mind, is that it's a function of what the sales conversation looks like, right? To understand what are leading indicators and lagging indicators. So, understanding kind of how that takes place, and what key metrics the sales force currently uses, as if there is one, to kind of understand its own pipeline, right? And it's sort of how leads are actually coming through to actually conversion or not. I think can be the way you build a scorecard to understand what are the right leading indicators for your pricing before the sale actually gets made. So that's the final point I would make on this, is that, my experience talking to the sales force is key. Implicitly, they understand better than anybody, anyone who's out there selling, whether this is in a retail context or a B2B kind of, sort of more handheld and high touch model. The people who are out there on the front line understand what drives customers' behaviors. They may not have formalized it. They may not all agree, but they have some sense of that, and that's always a great place to start, I think. And
your response is a little bit market research, a little bit understand what are your leading and lagging indicators.
Yeah.
Jim,
if I could maybe add to what James said there, I think, using all of the data that you get from your market research and everything, when you have a long sales cycle, one of the key is how do you conglomerate that data so that your sales team can use it? And I've always called it a deal desk, and you usually put the pricing people in the middle of the sales people, so there's a collaboration going on. You have your pricing analytics people working with your salespeople to analyze the data and look at those long sales cycles through a deal desk mentality and putting deal parameters around it. So it's not just a sales guy in the field coming to a sales manager and saying, we got to get this deal because they're not going to renew this contract for another 2 years, and we're going to miss our regional goals if we don't get this deal. So can I do whatever it takes to get this deal? We've all been there, and everyone's like, oh, we don't have any data. Taking those data parameters, pulling it into a deal desk, and creating some structure around it with pricing and sales working together is one of the key ways to leverage your pricing expertise with long sales cycle type of products.
And I think the last thing I'd say to that is, with a long sales cycle, you have the benefit and opportunity to extract a lot of information that you would not have the opportunity to do in a short sales cycle. So that gives you many, many opportunities for conversations to start thinking about what are those specific drivers that you can compete on. And then you can start building that bid around those drivers. Whereas you're not just reacting to the product, you're reacting to all of the other things the customer actually wants.
So to come back to Carter's question there, Adrian, to make it a little bit tangible, and to your earlier suggestion, you're telling Carter, if you have product A at, call it $100 a license, and you have product B at $60 a license, and they've chosen our product A minus 20% of whatever functionality that is, the fact that they've already engaged in the conversation around product A for the last 9 months is telling you that that's what they need, and it's not prices, they're not the major driver. Is that how I should read that comment?
Well, I'm reading two different examples, right? There's the SaaS conversation, and then there's the long life project.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Carter's product is also SaaS, but with a long.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I think what you can do in a 9-month sales cycle, for SaaS is you can really understand what are those specific service drivers, right? So, what are the pain points? And to me, do you default to the subscription model, or are there other fee structures that you can build in because you've extracted all this other information on your consulting services that go with it, the whatever downtime, fee structure that you might have that you're going to give them. Basically, what I'm getting at is you have 9 months to have a conversation that allows you to fine tune, as opposed to just defaulting to a single subscription fee. Does that help?
Yep. Thank you. Bert?
That's fair. So I've got a question I'll throw out there to Jim first, and the others can jump in. But putting yourself in the investor's shoes, maybe some of the folks on the call here today, what factors would you look at so that you can determine things like if you want to invest in improving your pricing, or and then if you do, how do you size the prize? And then finally, how confident are you? How confident you are that you can capture that value? So what are those factors that you would put out there for investors in that sort of frame of mind?
Yeah, so I think one thing we kind of touched on before is what has been done in the pricing space before. It's sometimes easy to contrast pricing, the revenue side versus the cost side. I think companies for a long time have always looked at ways of reducing cost, but it seems to be only more recently that many companies have moved into the revenue side, trying to put some more analytics behind that. So obviously the less that has been done on the revenue analytics side, certainly the more opportunity there is. But I guess a couple other points I would make is, in terms of sizing the prize or determining what kind of opportunity is there. I have always liked pricing because, unlike a lot of different projects that you might get involved in out there, and I know that I've been involved in the past, you could work on them for a year, 2 years, 3 years before you start seeing some benefit coming through. And the big difference with pricing is, once you do some analysis and raise your prices, you start seeing the benefit of that coming in the next day. So you very quickly see that. And I mean, it's the reason I like to do my own yard work, just because I go out and do it. An hour later, I look and I see what I've done and I feel really good about that. And pricing is kind of the same way. And so to me, the one thing that is harder about pricing, though, or at least I would say that really makes it deliver to the company is, are you just jacking up your prices with nothing behind it? Or are you delivering the customer an experience that is worth the increased price you're trying to charge them? So if you are making yourself very difficult for the customer to deal with, if the ordering process is hard, if the delivery, it's a slow delivery, he gets upset about that, quality's bad, and then you go try to raise the prices, that just might be the final straw for him to say, no, I'm done. Whereas on the other side, if you feel like you've put some effort behind some of those other areas and you're giving the customer an experience that he enjoys and values, then raising the price is something that, no one necessarily likes prices going up, but it's something that most customers would feel like it's worth the higher price if he's getting the experience he needs. So to me, that is a key. Is it just a price increase, or do you feel like you are delivering the customer an experience that justifies the higher price? And if the answer is yes to that, the odds of success is in my experience extremely high, that pricing will deliver, you know, as much or more than you might hope for.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So makes a lot of sense. A little bit of due diligence up front to understand what's been done, but also what's been done on pricing, but what's been done generally in terms of value to the end customer. What do you think about sort of the end of the road there? You know, confidence in capturing the value. Where do you develop the confidence in what you're going to be able to capture?
And maybe putting it into the context of a lot of folks on the call today, I feel like from a search fund backed companies, the main kind of like concern I've heard is, but our data is not as sophisticated as kind of like larger firms. So if knowing that they don't have kind of like a, you know, Oracle ERP system set up where everything is tracked in detail, and it might take them a little bit longer time to get that data. If you were kind of like in house shoes or MK's shoes and thinking about, okay, should we bring in pricing consultant to work with a company, but we don't have all the data already sorted out, what might make you feel more confident or less confident about being able to actually realize that value?
Yeah, so from my perspective, you know, part of it depends on what type of pricing model you have. If you have a very simple business where, you know, there's not many SKUs, there's, you know, everyone gets the same price, you know, there might not be, other than just raising the price a little bit, there may not be a lot of opportunity that would come from this analytics of really engaging a you know, a pricing consultant. But to the extent that you start having a number of SKUs with you know, with margin differences between them, with different types and different you know, a certain number of customers, more than just a few, that you can justify different prices to those different customers based upon the value that they provide you. As that complexity grows, you know, even if you don't have tremendous ERP system with all the data in there, the opportunity to get more and more out of this from a pricing standpoint grows. So I'd look at that.
Thanks, Jim. I'm gonna put the same question to you, Adrian. I know that you come in with a strong confidence with where you're going to be able to take your clients. So talk to me a little bit about how you develop your confidence and what you look for to really strengthen your confidence going in.
Yeah, so data is great for what we do. I do rely on analytics a lot, but I've never worked with a company and from 10 million to Fortune 500s that the data's been great. So that's like the first thing is I'd say, don't let the data scare you, work with what you've got. As you're building your understanding and your maturity, I think price transparency is a huge driver to that confidence. So depending on what market you're in, if there's price transparency, and there's a lot of price transparency today, you can build sophistication through things like web scraping, which is super, super cheap, but you can download massive amounts of prices for a lot of industries today, you know, for almost free, and build data sets that you probably didn't have before. And it might not be your customers, it might be your customers' customers, it might be your competitors, but you can build some price transparency if you didn't have it before, build data sets. You also can build data by talking to people. So I think every single person on this panel and all the participants, right, they understand that in certain businesses, as you're growing, you've got a couple very loyal customers that are willing to have very frank conversations with you. And having those very frank conversations of, we're not sure if we're really pricing to our value, you're going to hear it. They're going to tell you exactly where they think you actually are underpricing. So again, I wouldn't limit yourself to just the data. Build confidence through all of the possible areas that you can pull information.
James, anything to add to that?
I think I loved Adrian's last point. I'm thinking of a couple of projects that I've worked on. just one in particular to give you an example. I worked for a sort of a company that was introducing a brand new technology-based, digitally based product to a brand new market that through some regulations had suddenly come to appear, right? So there was no history of transactions to look at. There were the competitors it was a wide open field of which of our current competitors would decide to compete with us in this market. So how do you begin to sort of tackle these questions? And the answer is you in this case, we talked to, and we're talking about a handful, literally, the top 15 or 20 clients of my client, in the other things that we did, right? And this was kind of an adjunct to that. And we sat down, it was literally in half an hour, 45-minute conversations with the right people. That is, the people who make the decisions to buy. If it's a business, the individuals who are purchasing, obviously, if it's a consumer, with the right people in a conversation, I'd echo Adrian's point. You can get amazing insights as to sort of not only how you're doing, how your pricing has been historically, but even on a new product, what the right sort of structure and even potentially levels are that would be persuasive to them in a new setting.
Helpful. Understood. Al, I think you've got another one.
Yeah, Hal, I think you had a question for Jim on kind of like companies like Ingram Sales, and I know you don't want to speak directly to your companies, but broader context of things like and Gardner Denver's kind of like compressors already are more expensive than their Asian competitors, and how does kind of like product differentiation play into your ability to raise prices of a manufactured product? Does this come back to kind of like you talking about all these other add-ons like delivery and how easy it is to put in the order and how good is the service and things like that? Or are there any other factors that come into play there?
Yeah, there's a few factors there. So the first one, I would say, I think what Adrian said earlier is a key point, is that if you do have some less expensive competitor, maybe a Chinese competitor or something where you can't compete with the cost, it always is good to have multiple versions so that for those people who that price is really the most important, you have something that you can offer them without detracting from the value of the products you offer. And so you kind of cover those customers in that way. But then on the other side, it is good to be able to differentiate your product in some way. And if you can find certain things in the product that you can emphasize, then for sure that's one to do it. But even if you're in more of a commodity type area, then it's those other things that I mentioned before, and you just mentioned too, about making you a very easy company to do business with, whether it's ordering, delivering, product quality, support, everything about it, all those different touch points for the customer. If they really prefer dealing with you versus some others, that's a huge part of the battle. And I would say with raising prices sometimes on those, there's a number of customers, some percentage of them are just going to pay the price without even thinking about it. Either they don't buy often enough, they don't remember what they paid last time, or they just feel very comfortable in the relationship they have and they're not going to go out and search for other customers. So you get that portion of customers easily. It's those other ones that may push back. And that's where I think Jeremiah brought it up before, but if you have a good exception process in place to address those, and if you have a customer that is important to you and you don't want to lose, you have a process in place to not lose that customer.
And if I could, I think understanding your customer base, not to oversimplify it, but there's some people who are always going to buy on price. You have the vast majority who are value shoppers, and then you have the premium buyers. They're going to buy the most expensive ones all the time. Understanding which ones of those customers you're trying to sell to, so you don't waste sales efforts. If you're not trying to sell to beat everybody on price and sell to the cheapest ones, you shouldn't waste your time and effort trying to price to the cheapest. Work in that value segment, try to get those middle ones. Or if you are a premium offering, understand that you're a premium offering and where that comes in. I think sometimes I've seen a lot of companies I work with try to be everything to everybody, and that's really hard from a pricing standpoint. You have to identify what your product is, where you fit, what customers you fit better with. Are you value-based selling? Are you a premium offering? Or are you the cheapest out there? You want to win on price? That's very different dynamics, and making sure your whole organization is behind that so that you can craft that price strategy and not waste your organization's energy chasing leads that probably aren't going to fit that model.
Yeah, to Jeremiah's point, how coming back to that and something Adrian was saying and building upon that, if you're selling customized solutions with longer sales cycles, you can understand what's important to that customer. So let's say service is really important to one customer, but financing is really important to another customer. Now, you don't want to offer service and financing to all your customers, because then that's going to be eating into your margins. But if you're putting into kind of like custom proposals together for each client, they just like, what if I can bring in service or reduce, kind of like building some service into the contract here? Or what if I can build in financing into the contract here? How does that make our offer? Is it more competitive then? If you're dealing more with a mass product, then you could offer differentiated packages, one that is more service oriented and one that is more financing oriented, and see which ones the customers are willing to pay for, and maybe one that has both but is a little bit more expensive. But having kind of like being the right solution for the right customer, not everything to everyone, because then you can't beat them on price. Then you are the most expensive, way more expensive option that people are paying for stuff they don't really need.
So if you don't mind, can I just add one thing to your answer? I think you're exactly right. Differentiation here is key. Two thoughts. One is that you might find that this is where pricing structures can actually be very creative, right? I mean, we talk about it almost as an academic exercise, right? Is it a subscription model, or is it a per transaction model? Actually, if you really think about the elements that you might build into price, and I'll give you one example about this, is sort of how the findings that the things you discover can actually be valuable. I was helping a company figure out how to price an ongoing subscription model for the service it was providing. And we started to test with a couple of clients this notion of in addition to the subscription model, adding a sort of setup fee, effectively, right? Or an annual fee, in addition to sort of the ongoing subscription. And what we found, and this fee hadn't existed before, no competitors did it. We didn't think we were going to offer it. But what we actually found is that if we conceptually introduced a setup fee or an annual fee and then waived that fee, right, the take up in our product went up massively, much more than that which we were able to eke out by tweaking the ongoing subscription prices, right? So what we found was that introducing fees and waiving them. Now the client actually did not follow this path, but simply to create a new fee and waive it for a huge segment of customers was particularly persuasive. So I'm not suggesting we use smoke and mirrors to do this, right? But there are segments for whom different aspects of the price will be more or less appealing, and you can play with the other aspects potentially and optimize them. But those big chunks you may want to tackle differently.
That's a good point. And I think, we're talking about leverage points for making sure that these types of initiatives are successful downstream makes a lot of sense. Let's look upstream a bit in the actual initiative itself, the pricing initiative. Talking a little bit about what are the critical things that companies can do, in the engagement, before the engagement, to make sure that they're going to get those exceptional results, exceptional return, exceptional improvements. And on the flip side, what are some of the common reasons that pricing engagements fail? And Adrian, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, so I'm going to backpedal on my statement before. Getting data together is great. But yeah, so we don't really expect it, but it is helpful when it comes. I think the biggest challenge that I have with pricing engagements comes from, one, leadership not knowing who owns pricing. And that's very common, but who should and will own pricing in the future in their culture. And so because and it's one of the most common questions we get, right? Where should pricing reside, especially in a high growth business? And there's not really an easy answer to that, because there's some cultural elements to it. So it can't be as easy as like, let's just put the pricing person in sales because they're going to be quoting all the time. Well, then they're getting all the sales pressure to do volume, or we're just going to put them in finance and then they're not commercially sensitive. And so they're telling sales guys, but the number is this, right? So So I think putting a lot of thought process into that before an engagement has huge rewards. It allows the engagement to go much smoother. Making this the consultant's project and not our project, that's a recipe for disaster. Because pricing is incredibly emotional. No one likes the pricing consultant to show up. It's a very unpopular role. So if this becomes the pricing consultant's price or their strategy, it will never sustain. And I think the other thing is just positioning the pricing initiative as this is not an event. We are putting in sustainable continuous improvement processes and the foundation for long-term strategic advantage from pricing. It really, it changes the perspective of the importance of price when you're first looking at it for the first time. Otherwise, a lot of times it becomes the consultant's event. And as soon as the consultant leaves, everybody's ready to just, okay, let's go back to what we were doing before, as opposed to approaching it as we are going to embed these processes and these ways of thinking forever. So I think that's about it.
The only thing I would add, I think agree 100% with all of that, is trying to align the incentive structure to support a pricing initiative. Again, the salespeople are often the key to making sure that a pricing initiative can be successful. And if the salespeople are rewarded just based on sales and not margin or not price or something that affects that, it's too easy for them to not support the pricing project and go back towards just getting those sales goals and revenue goals. And so if you can get them on board with their incentive structure, but also have them as well as the rest of the company feel some confidence to be able to price, that becomes some of the other concerns that sometimes you've seen before, that the salespeople or others believe a lot of what they might hear from a customer or something and think that their product isn't as good and shouldn't be able to price at a premium or at least higher than it is today. And so you want to make sure that there is some confidence to be able to price. And a lot of times that comes from the data, some of the things that James was saying before, customer research and value and those type of things.
Can I add one more thing to that? Because that was incredibly astute, Jim. I think just to expand on that a little bit, the more you can as anytime as a leader to say, you're allowed to fail in this pricing initiative and that's okay. We're not going to can you if you lose an account. It makes a huge, huge difference on the effectiveness long-term. So thank you, Jim. I think you're absolutely right.
Those are both great points. I would say what I've seen from kind of like multiple clients we've worked with that has made it difficult for them to succeed when trying to do pricing changes is to only get help on the analytical component of an engagement and feel like the only expertise I need is for Jeremiah to come in and do a one-off analysis and set up the dashboard for us, and then we'll do the rest in-house. I'd say that I completely understand where smaller companies come from when they're thinking about that and saying like, look, it's expensive to have a consultant stick around for 12 months or 2 years. My suggestion there is have them still kind of like check in with you, maybe not as often, but once a week, once every other week, once a month, but have them do some of that hand holding, because you need that external expertise to instill the confidence in your team members as you're kind of like doing tweaks to the model. The model of kind of like coming in and doing kind of like just a purely market research-based pricing model and saying the prices should be X, that's very difficult to get a pricing engagement to become successful that way. You need to have the feedback loop built in there and continuously do these tweaks. And for that, you need some of that hand holding that engages with your key stakeholders and convinces them along the way of, look, let's take a bet on this. If I'm wrong, then we'll adjust it going forward. And we'll prove it very quickly if I'm right or wrong. Or let's kind of like try out what you're saying and see if it comes out back the way you thought about it. So making it a purely analytical exercise and a one-time exercise, I think, has been the recipe to failure that I've seen, or made it difficult for people to realize their pricing gains. What I've seen has contributed to the success are two main points. One is to start with low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is something that people, you have a lot of alignment or excitement around internally in terms of experimenting with that and demonstrating that success early on in the engagement. And I guess the second side of that same coin is to start with an internal champion in the sales team that is okay with championing or piloting these things. And it could be about pricing increases. But we've often found that there are one or two people within the sales team that are more okay with kind of like implementing a higher price model than the others. And starting with those has been easier than trying to roll it out to everyone at once. Jeremiah, James, any other best practices or worst practices you guys have observed over the years?
I think just building on what you said of it not being an analytics endeavor, not viewing it as we're just raising list prices. There's so many levers you can pull to eliminate leaks because we're giving away off invoice rebates or freight terms, or to look at your segmentation and say, you know, it's not we're raising prices across the board. There's small segments of customers, and really getting into the details of your business. So it's not just viewed by your company as an across the board price increase, but there's lots of different levers you can pull within your business that are going to have an impact on price. And when you do it as an analytics experiment, like you said, it usually just comes up, okay, we're increasing price at the top level by X%. And you're right, that has a tendency to fail quite frequently.
And I think the only other thought I'd add is, you know, as you think about this, and the reason it's not just an analytical exercise is because I mean, even as consultants, we don't want that, right? because we want to make sure we're not selling snake oil here, right? So we want to make sure that they're actually generating some of the results that we, you know, that the exercise tells us we could. I think, and so to that end, what I've found is that if you can think about a way to sort of chunk out the deployment, right? Again, whether that's in phases in terms of complexity, whether that's focused markets where you're looking at first or second. In other words, piloting it a bit. Not only can you test the efficacy of what you're proposing, but as you start to generate real results, you know, that really serves as a basis in some ways for self-funding, you know, the continued work of the consultant with you guys and the partnership going forward as you begin to roll this out, right? So you're generating results is a good way to sort of deal with any kind of cost or funding questions, you know, more quickly rather than having to wait for the curtain to be pulled open, you know, several years later, if you can see results on a more progressive basis.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Switching it, you know, flipping the coin on the other end, let's talk about, you know, if you were helping a friend maybe evaluate, you know, which pricing consultant that they should pick, any advice that you would give to your friend? Let's start with you, Adrian.
Well, I think, you know, I think it depends on where you are in the maturity curve, right? So again, you know, I use the benchmark of most companies when they're starting, they're either in chaos, and that's going to be a pretty high level of an engagement for handholding and change management based on what we were just talking about, or they're going to be in a lack of differentiation where everybody's kind of used to some center of control setting pricing, and it becomes more of a strategic exercise. So the level of engagement and the kind of pricing consultant you're going to need, it's going to be based on, is this going to be a more strategic exercise, or is this going to be more of a change management exercise? And sometimes it's also, you know, are you going to bring in software? So, you know, some companies will invest in some of the software options that were shared in the beginning. That takes somebody probably who's had experience in software deployment as well. But yeah, I think it really depends on how the consultant's approaching it. So most of us will do analytics of some sort. I think in the group, it's a big portion of what we do. But some organizations are not going to need that, right? Because they have very few SKUs, they have very few customers, or their customers are very similar. So for those that have complexity, though, the software capabilities Jeremiah shared, that's going to be very important to be able to do that level of analytics as well.
a good point, and you touched on a little bit of, I'll let the others answer as well, but Adrian, before we swap off, any other transferable skills versus kind of critical industry focused skills that investors should or C-suite should be looking at when they're looking at a consultant? You touched on some of those skill sets. Any other kind of maybe broad functional skills or specific industry focused skills that you think would be critical for people to look at?
Yeah, I think, and my colleagues here might have a different take on this. Pricing to me is a lot like accounting. 80% of it totally translate from industry to industry to industry. There is 20% that does not. And so, for me personally, I tend to focus in manufacturing and distribution. I dabble in the rest of the spaces, but I think there's, for most of us who've been doing this for some time, have kind of found our niche. Software tends to be a unique space, right? Where you're bringing kind of a different lens than a lot of these high analytics lenses typically. So I do think that there is a benefit of understanding the verticals that the consultants have come from. However, that being said, manufacturing, sometimes people say, well, have you been specifically, like I recently was asked, have you specifically priced in this type of specialty metals? Well, specialty metals is specialty metals. So no, not in this particular metal, but I've seen a whole bunch of other metals. So if that makes sense, I think the verticals translate pretty well. Specifically industries, but you may want to be a little bit more specific when you're jumping from something like high tech to manufacturing to distribution to retail.
Perfect. No, that makes a lot of sense. James, what are your thoughts there? Any sort of critical things that you would advise somebody to look out for as a looking for pricing consultant, and in terms of skill sets, transferable or otherwise?
I think so. I think in terms of expertise, I think Adrian just handled the industry part of this very well. I think the other side of that, which is kind of the more functional expertise side of things, what strikes me is that again, so that we're posing the question as if sort of you're selecting one person to be your pricing consultant, right? As opposed to sort of maybe putting together a team of people. But so within that model, I mean, you are looking for, in a sense, not quite a jack of all trades, but you are looking for someone who sort of can cover the bases, certainly for the range of the pricing engagement that you're working on. But I do think that understanding, if I were going to advise someone, having the technical expertise to be able to kind of look at the data, assemble the data, and look at the data, I think is going to be important. But having the broad-based sort of ability to step back and really do, use an old cliche, to see the forest, through the trees and the branches and the twigs of the data, right? To be able to step back and understand, what are we great at? What are we trying to do in the marketplace? How does that translate to why people buy from us? Having this sort of a more strategic view of things, in my mind, given the work I've done, would be critical, I think, even for something that feels a bit more tactical in terms of the engagement you want to deliver. So I think ideally someone who sort of played across the pricing spectrum, from sort of really nitty gritty kind of price setting back through all of the bigger questions around, where does price play in the value proposition? I think you'd want someone who sort of has experience dealing across those phases, because at companies this size, inevitably the engagement touches on all of that, right? Even if you think it's really a narrow question of, we need to optimize the pricing of our X widget in these markets, it really sort of very quickly unravels into a much bigger question. So I think a broad-based skill set is important.
If I could just add, I couldn't agree more. I think all of us have spent our whole career in pricing because if you've done that, you love the fact that it touches all aspects of the business. I think one of the best ways I've always described it is, you kind of sit in the middle between operations, maybe it's manufacturing operations or service operations, and sales on the other end, and you're sort of you're doing your job well if both sides dislike you, right? If sales isn't 100% happy with you and operations isn't 100% happy with you, you're doing your job well. So you need pricing people that can play in the sales and marketing space, play in the operations space, and obviously have the technical background to do the analytics and the pricing know-how to bring to both sides of the business.
Bert, I think another way of asking that question is, a lot of our clients, the first question they ask of a pricing consultant is, what experience do you have in our industry? And if I were in their shoes, I'd try to understand a little bit more about their type of experience or the types of clients they worked with. And there are a few levers that I will try to unpack. One is around kind of like the customer concentration within the industries they worked with. Is it kind of like high volume products, low volume products? Is it a long sales cycle, short sales cycle? The number of SKUs, where have they dealt with thousands or millions of SKUs, or 10 SKUs, 2 SKUs at each company they work with? The second part is around kind of like I'd say, or third part, and I guess becomes around the customer journey. If you're dealing with kind of like a customer journey where, let's say in the pharma sector, where a person is influenced by a number of other people, experts along the journey, versus it's a very quick customer journey or straightforward one, it's very different decision-making processes. Then you have around some technical skills like software deployment. Of course, that's a critical component. And then past successes, and see, is this someone who's capable or not? Those are maybe a few of the main components I tried to look at. What I would do is to ask a couple of consultants, hey, can you map out the steps in a possible engagement with me? I'm not talking about a 20-page proposal, but let's just talk about what are the 5-6 main steps in the journey. And what kind of types of businesses have you worked with where you think that gives you the comparable skill set to be able to do it for us? If it's someone who's kind of like only worked with SaaS businesses, and the SaaS businesses have each had 3 product offerings on their website, and you're trying to deploy this for a manufacturing business with 10,000 SKUs, maybe it's not as transferable of a skill set. I think you can get to the bottom of that pretty quickly if you unpack it a little bit.
Anything to add, Jim? That was great, Ad. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I think what Ada said is right on. I guess the only other thing outside of that I was thinking about a little bit is again, I haven't been a consultant. I have hired pricing consultants and pricing companies over the years, and the one thing I would say is, I mean, I'm a pricing guy. My wife often reminds me how difficult it is to live with me, but what that means is, you know, because we're pricing people, the cost that we're paying for what we're getting, you know, is something we think about. And if you're paying for a consultant or a company, you know that you're going to have that cost. That cost is 100% certain. What you don't know is what profit or what revenue lift you're going to get from it. So you're basically trading a guaranteed cost for the hopes of getting some return. And so you have to think about what appetite you have for an ongoing cost like that. And having hired and had working in my companies, some of the companies that you had on the earlier slide that were, you know, kind of the software type, Vendavo, Insight to Profit type companies, they are expensive. And so invariably what has happened with me and them in the past is that after a while, that's a cost. The excitement of the initial project goes past, but that's not an ongoing cost that my management had wanted to keep going over a number of years. So I kind of come back to something, especially for the size companies maybe that are most relevant that we're talking about here, is that getting something that can continue to give you the benefit over the long term at an ongoing annual cost that makes sense for your size business. And I see, you know, we developed, when we got rid of some of the companies I just mentioned, we built an internal tool similar to the same kind of analytics that we saw from Jeremiah earlier. And that's something that we're able to continue with at a very reasonable cost. And no one is ever threatening to get rid of that or to eliminate that, because it is a relatively small cost, but it does give us the analytics that we need to continue to move our business forward. So I do think that cost is kind of a key to think about upfront.
Yeah, perfect. No, that helps, Jim. I appreciate the insight there. I guess kind of one of the final kind of wrap up questions here. Can anyone talk about, you know, Adrian, I think you mentioned this before, but, you know, thinking about, you know, times when you've seen prices increase on a product out there and, you know, suspecting that maybe a pricing consultant has increased their prices out there, just, you know, from your experience, kind of jokes aside though, you know, how can you minimize the backlash from customers when rolling those prices out?
Well, I think, you know, one of my positions is that most organizations feel like they hire professional salespeople that are supposedly, you know, they've been trained, they're savvy. So we're going to throw them out in front of customers and we're going to tell them go defend value. Except we're not going to tell them how to do it because we don't even understand our value, right? And so, so a lot of times what you're asking about, these are instances where a company has thrown out a price increase and they did not put together the really important step of communication and training on why is this the right thing to do, right? And so if your price increase is not defendable, it probably was not a good idea. So I think, how do you manage that? You don't raise the price unless you're ready to raise the price, I guess is my response. You need to do that pre-work.
Good point. James, any thoughts from your perspective on that?
Well, the only thought I wanted to add, actually, because this has been a theme we've repeated, this is, I want to just say this so it's obvious to us, I think, but maybe less obvious to our audience, is that though we've talked about raising price constantly, right? That's been an example that's been underlying many of the questions we've answered here. In many respects, pricing is not about raising prices, right? I mean, by itself, pricing is about selectively figuring out the pockets where you can raise the price without generating too much attrition, and other pockets where you need to lower the price to compete and take market share. And that optimization is what we're shooting for here. So I just want to make the point, it's not, we've shorthanded it by saying, we're talking about raising prices, and that's how the questions have been put to us. But the subtlety is it's not all the unpleasant conversation about where you're jacking up the price. A lot more, I think, of the interesting conversation is where are we gonna sacrifice margin in order to gain share while recovering that share in some segments by raising price. So that's not a direct answer to the question that you just asked, but I think it's important to remind everyone that we're playing on both sides here.
No, it's a poignant point. Jim, what are your thoughts there? I know you talked a little bit about, you know, managing customer expectations, that sort of thing, but any thoughts on how to manage, you know, minimize the backlash there?
Yeah, I mean, one is, and I think Adrian said it, you know, confidence to price. You want to have confidence to price, and the way you get confidence to price is that you know, hopefully you can do some competitive research. You understand what you're up against, and if you have a product that deserves the price that you're trying to get. So to have the people really believe that. The customers, and there it's hard to persuade your customers of that if your salespeople that are talking to them don't believe that. But then the next thing I would say is, and I said before, you know, it's always good to have an exception process and to know what customers you're trying to get. I am a big fan of customer segmentation, and if you are not segmenting your customers, identifying which type of customers are important to you, that you want to have, it, to the extent that your competitors are doing some level of that customer segmentation, if you're not doing it, you are inadvertently just getting all the customers that they don't want. You know, the ones that they just let slip by, that's who you get. You end up with a number of customers that other guys don't want to have. So you really need to identify what kind of customer you want. And again, you know, put your prices at an appropriate level that you feel confident in. But again, if you run into an issue where a customer that is important to you, you know, you come down to a price situation, you know, have a process in place that you can make the decision whether it's important to you to keep that customer with some type of concession. And I think if you can do that, you can get that increased margin from the customers that are just going to pay it without really paying much attention. And then you can use some of that margin to maintain the customers that you really want to keep that are pushing back on price.
And I suppose the unwritten side of that coin also is if you've been in a situation where you haven't segmented your customers and this is the first time you're doing it and taking that approach, there is going to be some attrition, and having management alignment on customers that you no longer want because they don't fit the segments and the markets you're now going after, because now you have a strategy, you have a definition, you're targeting certain segments. Being comfortable saying, yep, there's some angry customers, but we're okay with that. We knew that was going to happen, and making sure that pre-engagement, pre-pulling the trigger on that price change, you have organizational alignment that that's going to happen, and your organization doesn't freak out when a few of those customers fall by the wayside.
Thanks, Jeremiah. That's helpful. So I think we've got time for one more. I think, Ada, do you have one?
Yeah, I have one question that MK would like to ask, but he's too polite to do so, so I'll ask it for him. What is the rough cost for a pricing project if you're thinking about kind of like lower middle market companies? Bert, I think you can maybe take this in terms of ranges you've seen.
Yeah, perfect. And it's tough because companies, no matter their size, want to get their ROI that they're targeting, and it becomes challenging at the lower end of the middle market. But what we have a pretty common range for kind of the three phases that we see when we engage in a pricing project, and it kind of breaks down into that diagnostic, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, or 4 weeks, whatever it needs to be to really have the individual get their arms around the challenge, understand the business and the pricing as it stands, and to understand how to size the prize. And what we usually see is right around $50K for that diagnostic. And what we do is then moving into, let's call it year one of the implementation, we credit that diagnostic fee towards that implementation if it's bolted on within a reasonable amount of time. And we kind of see that year one in a bit of a range for cost, in terms of size, complexity, number of SKUs, that sort of thing. But generally on the lower end, we would call that year one an additional 100K for on the small side. A mid-sized company in this range, maybe 10 to 20 million, the 250K, and then maybe a little bit larger size companies, we're talking about an additional 350K for that year one fee. Talking about year two and on, that's sort of a as necessary, a basis. We typically are seeing consultants staying around to help with handoff, additional, tying a pretty bow on this initiative or that SKU, and it really depends on the needs of the specific company. Nobody knows what that is today, and it really kind of depends on what happens in the year one implementation. But that'll typically drop off and be something like a daily rate basis with the consultant on an on-needed basis. So that's sort of the rough ballpark view of what we see in the pricing for initiatives like this. And Ada, anything else on that? Does that make sense?
Nothing else on my end. I don't have any other questions in the chat box from the audience. Were there any other questions you wanted to cover while you have the panel online?
That was everything on my list that I wanted to touch on today. On the whole, I appreciate everyone's time today, panelists and participants. Really appreciate you making time, towards the end of the year here. I know things get crazy, but generally, if anyone is interested in talking about pricing opportunities and how something might be done with one of their companies, feel free to reach out to me. I can provide my email here if you don't have it. I know I've chatted with a number of you on a few occasions, but I'm happy to chat and talk through what our support might look like, and maybe get you connected up with one of these fine folks on the panel. But otherwise, have a great rest of the week here and the holidays ahead, and look forward to what 2021 brings for all of us.
Yep. And Hal and Jeremiah, I noticed Hal had a direct question for Jeremiah's model. If you have a minute to stay on after everyone drop off, maybe you can cover it just very quickly now afterwards.
Hey, I wanted to thank all the panelists. Really appreciate your input and insights into pricing. Very many great points for all of us on board here. And to Jim, my family says the same thing about a value investor. Can't we get a BMW just because they're fun, even though they're expensive? Hell no, the Dodge Durango will do.
I like it. Yeah.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to April for arranging this seminar for us. Really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Appreciate it.